everybody.
Hi, guys.
To start out with, why don't we just go around and say our name, what organization we're with, or what our profession is. So I'll go first. My name is Bethany Clark. I am the marketing coordinator with Peace at Home Family Shelter.
Sure. My name is Sam Ash, and I have my master's in social work, and I'm currently working as a mental health coach.
I'm Megan Tullock. I'm the Director of Programs and Advocacy at Northwest Arkansas Equality.
Thanks. I'm Abby Underwood. I'm the Community Education Coordinator at Peace at Home Family Shelter.
And I'm Amber Jackson, and I am a psychotherapist in private practice.
Fantastic. So to start us off, I'm going to just ask a little bit about domestic violence. What is it? Why are we doing this during October? What is Domestic Violence Month? So.
I can take that one away. So Domestic Violence Awareness Month has existed for about 30 years now. And it's a time for us to raise awareness around the experiences of domestic violence survivors, but also to unite between our community and the service providers, like Northwest Arkansas Equality, like counselors, or like Peace at Home. This month, we're focusing a lot on education, just talking about like what does it look like for survivors in Arkansas right now. What kinds of issues are they facing? So we are super excited about October and super excited that all of y'all are joining us.
Yeah. And I feel like one thing that a lot of people don't fully grasp about domestic violence is it's not just about physical violence. It can be mental, emotional, financial, sexual, there's a whole array of things that go into what domestic violence is. So that's one of the parts that we are educating about. So who does domestic violence impact? Megan, do you want to take that away?
I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like it impacts people of all races, socioeconomic groups, genders, sexualities, across the board. It happens.
Domestic violence doesn't discriminate, so it can really touch anyone, anytime, anywhere. So that's part of why awareness is so important, is because you never know who in your community, whether it's your neighbors or your friends, might be facing an unhealthy relationship that they don't know how to navigate alone.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, so short answer, everyone, anyone and everyone. So kind of in that same realm of who does it impact and how can we identify what domestic violence is, what are some lesser known warning signs of domestic violence?
Yeah. I feel like I'm talking a lot, but
Go
I get
for it.
super passionate about this one. So like Bethany mentioned, domestic violence is not just about physical abuse, even though culturally we tend to associate those two things. It's a pattern of trying to maintain control and power over somebody in your household, and an intimate partner violence that's against your partner. And so something that I would watch out for a lot is a sense of entitlement. If your partner feels entitled to you, your body, your time, your emotions, your resources, a lot of times that can look like having really strict expectations maybe about when you can text back or call back, always having to share your location. If one partner's deciding all the time about how you have sex or when you have sex or how you spend money, those are some things that I would maybe think about. Do you feel safe in that environment? Is there an imbalance of power in your relationship? And if there is some anxiety around that, how can you reach out and get some help there? We have some counselors here though, so I would love to hear y'all's perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, kind of just going off of what you were saying there, the idea of, high control, high demand systems. And so in regards to what do we look for, when you're with a partner, and it doesn't always just have to be with a partner, it can be within a system, a family system, an organizational system where you work, where power and control presents. But one of the things too is the rigidity that occurs when somebody, it's like when we don't get what we want or things don't go our way, which is the way that life goes, right? Things don't happen the way we want them to. And so it's the response to that. When something doesn't go the way we expect it to or want it to, do we implement a rigid code to make sure that we get those things to make ourselves feel safe through the control? Or have we learned flexibility and the ability to, shift perspectives, try on somebody else's experience, and then maneuver with fluid and flexibility?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Awesome.
If I can jump in more,
Yes.
I'm sorry, this is what I get so excited about.
This is why we're here. Keep going.
I do think one thing that I would watch out for if I was talking with a member of the LGBTQIA plus community is entitlement when it comes to how you present and how you share your identity. So if you have a partner that is really trying to help you make decisions about your presentation, but it's showing up as control. So for example, they're controlling how you dress, what pronouns you use, where you're able to express your preferred gender. That's something that's yours. And that's maybe a warning sign of some broader issues around power and control that I would be concerned about. Also when it comes to coming out, even if you've come out to a partner with one of your identities, maybe it's your gender identity, maybe it's your sexual orientation, that is still your identity. You still get to make decisions about when and where that is shared. And if your partner is threatening to out you to your colleagues, your friends, your family, and is kind of holding that over you, that's something that I would also watch out for as a warning sign.
Consent.
Yeah, consent is a big
Right,
one.
so consent shows up in all those places of, which also goes along with autonomy, and, not just our bodily autonomy, but our, psychosocial, emotional autonomy. Yeah, for sure.
I think too, that conversation around sexuality and gender identity, I think that we're taught in heteronormative society too that you have a sexuality but that it's your partner that creates that sexuality, that your sexuality is not yours and this is your partner. But that your partner is all the information that anybody needs about what your sexuality is, including you. So I think particularly around marriage or I think all kinds of structures in just standard, regular, old, everybody, whatever your sexuality, whatever your gender, we're taught to think about ourselves in relation to other people instead of having those things be ours, our gender, our sexuality. So I just, to kind of broaden what you were saying there, I think that that's not something that, I think that because LGBTQ gender and sexuality is so visible, we can see that in ourselves in a way that maybe straight and cis people, it doesn't come up as much, but it's still coming up. I think it's, we're bad at it as a whole society, thinking about those as being things that are our own.
Yeah, I like how you touch on, the internal locus of control versus the external, and how in high control, high demand systems, we are taught to, basically annihilate any internal, self-awareness, how do you feel, what do you think, what is my experience, to accommodate, the system that is in control. So it gets annihilated, and so to your point, that idea of, what do I get to decide, not who am I in relation to, my partner, the system. Yeah.
And I think we're all unlearning that.
Yeah.
And so when we're in, when we're in relationship, we're unlearning those things together. So I think trying to have a partnership that's conducive to that unlearning, we're
Via flexibility.
Right. So
Yeah.
so that's what I loved about what you were saying, Amber, is that it's the response when something doesn't go your way, right? How does the relationship system work?
That doesn't work for me,
right?
But it works for you. So what am I going to do with that? When maybe it worked a minute ago, but then you've decided something different, autonomy, choice.
Yeah.
And now I, not necessarily have to acclimate to you. I have to acclimate to myself.
I have to make a decision.
And what does what does that mean for me? How do I feel? How do I regulate? And so when we talk about emotional and psychological safety, it is about, each individual person being able to really self-soothe and regulate, because when we can do that, then we can allow people to change and move about us, and, we don't have, that urge to control.
Yeah. So every relationship where that's not perfect is then an abusive relationship.
Yeah.
But but being in a learning process, feeling like you're safe to learn and grow, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely,
That's
right?
right.
Because I think we all are unlearning, and so we all
Sure.
mess up or make them. We all control,
Mhm.
and we all do the thing. But it's the ability to, when someone says, "Hey, you're kind of hurting me, or you're, causing harm," that practice of being like, "Oh, that's right," because I grew
Yes,
up in this
thank you.
system, and so we tend to, this is where I get into my Jungian, but we are unconscious. Our shadow would say, that the harm that is done to us is what we project out. And so the ability to, allow people to say, "Hey, you're doing the thing. Hey," and so that practice, not about perfectionism, like, "Hey, I'm never going to do the thing." It's about when we do it, do we have the flexibility and ability to regulate when we're called out.
Yeah, to build off of that, one thing that I'll add too is that another thing that can really be a big warning sign is when there's not really an ability in the relationship for both people to have their own experience of what's happening. When there's that big power imbalance, it can be the case that when one partner brings up a concern or tries to articulate, "Hey, this is how I'm experiencing that," it's a pretty big red flag if in response to that, what you get is, "Well, that happened because you did this, this, and this," and it's immediately turned around and kind of turned into a, "Well, it's your fault that you're feeling that," and that's a really common dynamic that can pop up.
The accountability, which is a really big part of interventions that like the Duluth model of the power and control that when we look into interventions, it is about the perpetrator or the system and the community taking the accountability and learning how to try on shame, which is appropriate for accountability, but not the kind of shame that was used. And so we develop a really kind of messed up relationship sometimes to shame and what it actually means to be accountable. But absolutely, for people to stop doing harm, we have to do the accountability piece.
Yeah. I love this. So much good information happening. So kind of following along the lines of, you guys did a great segue of pulling in the LGBT community in relation with domestic violence. What are some barriers that people find, or what are barriers that keep people from seeking help or leaving an abusive relationship?
I feel like the biggest one from where I sit is the additional pressure on LGBTQ individuals and couples to be seen as perfect. It's like you're already gay, so like you've taken like all of our slack for your relationship has been absorbed into that queer identity, and like you are not allowed on top of that to have problems. I think there's that, and then I think there's the fear that if you do open up about having an abuse situation or a fear of abuse in your relationship, hearing like, "Well, let me tell you where the problem. Let me solve this for you. It's the gayness." Like if you want to dismantle what the problem is, it's right there. So.
Yeah. Well, and that could be a tactic too used by so many abusers, because I think oftentimes when we're talking about LGBTQIA plus abuse, what happens is the messages of an abuser can line up with the messages that we're getting from the outside culture. So if you're not conforming to the norm, and you're being told by the culture that is bad, that you don't deserve to express yourself that way, and then also your partner is using that identity as leverage to get you to comply with what they want, it can be really hard to discern your worth and your separateness, your ability to express that identity the way that you deserve to, in the midst of so much kind of noise. And so that's, I think, a big barrier to, specifically in this population, to getting help is looking out at a culture that's also, like you were talking about, doesn't have a lot of slack for you, doesn't have a lot of grace for you going through hard things, and also just doesn't have a lot of understanding as far as the way that those difficulties, the way that your relationship functions might work. So even as far as like leaving a relationship, if you're trans, what kinds of things might you need leaving that relationship? What kinds of things might be essential to you that wouldn't be essential in a lot of other relationships? All of that is stuff that I think needs to be talked about more and is essential for building that more compassionate community. to those survivors.
I think there are also a lot of really harmful narratives that can get in the way of people being able to really disclose what they're experiencing. For a lot of LGBTQ folks, they may already be pretty isolated from other forms of support, whether that's family, or even community resources that are just inadequately equipped to understand some of the nuances.
They're not queer informed.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And a lot of the narratives around what abuse looks like, who is the perpetrator, who's the victim, a lot of that is often very gendered in ways that don't quite fit a lot of queer or trans experiences. And so I think that being able to address some of those narratives is a really important part of having the resources available to be responsive to the vast spread of experiences that can fall under that.
There are a lot of intersectional challenges as well, and I think that all kinds of, like, many of the things that keep people in abusive relationships, like financial insecurity, right? And financial insecurity lands more heavily on the LGBTQ population. So you're more afraid of leaving because where will you live if you leave? And I think, that's just like sort of one example there. I think too, having such a small pool of people that you feel like you can date, or can both increases the pressure on the relationship in a lot of different ways, both for the abuser, who can become more controlling because they don't want to lose their partner, and then for the person who would need to leave, can be like, well, this hurts, but at least I'm not alone, and if I leave, I'll be alone. And I think I don't know, I think there's just like so many kind of caught in.
Well, and that shows up too as far as social support when you leave, because if you and your abuser both share the same community, both go to all of the same places, share a lot of the same friend groups, that can make it a lot harder, along with that perfectionism, to voice, hey, this is my experience. I don't feel safe in this relationship, because you don't maybe have as much like separate support from your partner. And your friends, really your family, chosen family, or biological family, might face pressure to choose which story they believe, which happens in all abuse situations, but that's a big barrier, particularly for this smaller, tight-knit community.
Yeah, and just the whole idea of your relationship being like debated within that really small community, I think is so like, will your narrative carry the day? And if your partner is very charismatic and is good at creating those high control, high demand relationships, they're doing that in other places too. So you have you're likely to have less.
Yeah, and also too, this idea of, typically, generally speaking, the queer community has experienced erasure, in their primary communities, right? Their family systems, their church systems, their, growing up. And so when people have those high control demand, relationships, for someone who wants to leave that, and already, like you're saying, the community in and of itself is small, the antidote to trauma in general is connection, right? So, maintaining, which is why isolation is such a tool of the abuser. And so to your point of, if trying to make connections and maintaining relationships, and people have already experienced, that feeling of, well, but if I, come out of this, what will I have? And it won't be maybe the type of choices where if, people who are not in the queer community have no choices, and can move freer about, just within their systems. So yeah, I think that it definitely is. There's
layers of isolation.
There's lots of layers of
and
isolation.
Threat of isolation. And there's trauma of previous isolation.
And so that idea of, I can tolerate this thing that's familiar to me, that I know what to do. I know when the abuser, there is a cycle of, there's a honeymoon, there's, sort of like and then there's escalate. I mean, it's a cycle, and people get really familiar. Their nervous system gets familiar with that, and that can be, I'm going to nerd out real quick, but neurons that fire together, wire together, so that can be, something that becomes the familiarity, that choice of I mean, so for me, what I see is a lot of, breaking that, well, is it safer to go outside of this? Will I actually have, these relationships that are going to, or do I stay and just, at least it's familiar and I know what to expect and what to do with it. Yeah.
You know how to navigate.
Navigate the thing.
Outside
Right.
is very scary.
Yeah. So let's get a little bit personal. So we can each kind of put ourselves in the shoes of someone in an abusive relationship who's part of the LGBT community. I know that for me, I grew up very religious, and it wasn't until I started like deconstructing my religious trauma, my childhood, all the things that my parents believed apart from what I believed, did I realize that I was actually gay, and oh wow, these things have always been there, it's just always been hidden. And so my coming out was very complicated due to my family being very religious. So I know that if I was in an abusive relationship and I needed to, I would be first of all very hesitant to even talk to my family about it, because of one, I know that they wouldn't support me being in a relationship with a woman anyway, and then for me being like, oh yeah, but all of these things are happening, then they would do the, well yeah, of course, because you're in a relationship with a woman. This is like, what did you expect to happen? So I think finding support would be very difficult for me. I think having the layers of how coming out felt like such a big thing, and then it would feel very unvalidating. Is that a word?
Yeah.
Invalidating. Thank you. Just the whole experience, I think it would be invalidating. It would feel isolating again, and it's something.
I think you bring up a really good point about religious trauma.
Yes.
And this idea too about, and you mentioned it too when you were talking earlier, this idea that queer relationships are seen by the religious conservative viewpoint as sin, right? It's already sin. So that idea, if a queer couple comes, say, to therapy, it's like, well, but you're sinning anyway. So, like, this is a
already
problem.
irredeemable.
You're
Whatever
already
you're
a
doing
problem
there.
here, right? Just like existing is a problem. And that in and of itself, I mean, I think that's what I hear you saying, like going and getting, support, this idea that well, they already, see me as, a sinner.
Right.
And not to mention too, when we get into like intimacy, sexual intimacy, if a couple comes in and it's like, we want to talk about our sex life and we want to talk about sex, this idea of, the queer community being hypersexualized, right? So that layer of, if we're talking about, sexual relationships with one another, that other layer of, is this person going to be viewing that, differently if this was a heterosexual, sexual discussion, and all those layers, that do come from, with some of the effects of, purity culture.
I think also, connected to that is that there can be this belief that if you've experienced abuse or interpersonal violence, that's part of the reason that you're queer.
Yes.
There's already a lot of
the uneducation
yeah.
and the myths.
Yeah, but there's already a lot of this, contested area around the legitimacy of people's identity and experience, and so to add on to that, the vulnerability of disclosing that you've experienced violence or abuse in that way, and to know that there's very real possibility that people may
Victim blame. Say, well, that's
Yes.
because you're queer.
yeah,
So-
or that your queerness is because
Queerness,
of that,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think out of uneducation too, there is a potential for people potentially like normalizing abuse within queer relationships when they wouldn't do that with a heterosexual couple. I think especially too, you talked a little bit earlier about like the ways that we project from heterosexual couples and their their experiences of abuse onto queer relationships, a lot of times that means that the abuse of masculine presenting partners or male partners who are physically larger gets erased. And that can be, if we were talking about barriers, that can be a huge barrier to getting help. If when you are trying to disclose abuse, you're potentially facing somebody who's going to say, well, you can't be being abused, look, they're small and pretty. Or you're a man, your partner is also a man. How can you
I mean, and there's a
experience
heavy, right, as I was kind of looking through some of my DB stuff in the office, I mean, the gendered language,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
When he hits her, when he does this to her. And I mean, so I think this idea too of course men can be abused. And by other men, by other women, by, yes, and abuse, again, like that opening question, isn't reserved for just one population or one type of person or gender or presenting human.
Sure. I think to your point too, Sam, that I think it's again so many layers. Like there's so much victim blaming for people who experience intimate partner violence. It's like a stain or something. I think in like that there's a kind of person who gets abused that if you had just done it a little differently, or like if you had a better picker, or like I mean I just that there's so much it's on you. Yeah. And then I think like the way that being abused as a kid can then maybe be abused as an adult, and then if you mix queerness into that, it's just so many layers of like it's all your fault. It's something intrinsic in you that this other person is responding to, like kind of a boys will be boys idea, but like people around you will be people around you. Like that it's something that's like
And
stuck
also
to you.
for the person experiencing it, the idea, you know, it does make me think about when the Me Too movement was coming out and Ivanka Trump, Freudian slip, Trump, said something like, well, you know, that would never happen to me. Like that would, you know, because that toxic femininity of, like, that's not going to happen to me because I'm strong, and so that idea that, well, but it does happen to us, you know, and most of us, you know, have experienced some form of high control, high demand experiences, and it doesn't mean anything about us.
Yeah.
And so that idea that it only happens to that kind of person or to this because, you know, so there can be like an inverted sort of victim blaming of, you know, but even if it's occurring to me, you know, like, of course it's not occurring to me because I'm strong. Because I'm so strong and you know, that there's no way that would happen.
Well, and I think that too connects with how our culture perpetuates the same kind of messages that abusers can use, because that belief that, oh, I hold all the cards as the victim, like if I just tiptoed around it and did something differently, if I had played these differently, I wouldn't be in the situation that I'm in now. That is something that is so common when you're in the experience of abuse. But
Because accountability
Exactly.
gets so distorted and people internalize it and say, well, if I just would have done this or this, I'm like, why are you taking all that? Like, that is not for you to even be, you know, playing with. Like, why shouldn't I have done this or that?
Yes.
And so that ability to really go, oh, this isn't mine.
Yeah.
Well, and getting good at navigating that cycle, which victims get very good at, then it does feel like there are cards that you can play, right? You know which cards to play to minimize and like
To survive. Sure.
I think the word I was looking for is survive.
Yeah. And so how do we, you know, differentiate, like, I'm surviving, and at the same time, like, it's really not mine to have to do. Like, I really shouldn't be doing this labor of surviving so hard.
Yeah.
You know, but I'm going to, because I'm going to survive. But I'm aware that, like, it's really not mine.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And so much resistance culturally is required there to say that there is no one type of person that gets abused. There is no history that predisposes you to be abused, that is your fate.
Right.
You are a person that deserves to feel safe in your relationships, regardless, period. And so being able to hold on to that, I think, in yourself, but also find spaces where that truth about you is affirmed and supported. Is very
The
important.
self-worth component, which I think that it's hard to be queer and to feel self-worth in a world that tells you all the time that you don't have it.
Yeah.
So the familiarity of the worthlessness as which one of these are
And accessing to resources. I mean, it's not, right, not fact that there's a lot of homophobia and transphobia within even social, systems that, are there to support people, and the layers of, we've kind of talked about them, this idea of, well, maybe you don't deserve the help because, you're sinning, and so, that kind of thing. But even, those places that really, really helpful places, can have those layers of homophobia.
And it's important to note too, I think, that in those spaces, that again, we don't put one person into the category of abuser, one person into the category of victim. That spaces like Peace at Home, trans people are welcome. Anybody who is experiencing abuse is welcome. But that's a really intentional practice that as systems, as people who are providing services, we have to really put work into.
You have to really think about.
Yes.
Well, so if we do welcome, our trans community, then how are we doing something different?
Yes.
Because how are we actually really welcoming them? Not just saying, okay, yeah, you can come
You're
on in, and then they come in, and then it's like, well, this isn't working for me, and I'm actually experiencing more trauma again, and all the things, and it's like, well, but no, we said you could come in.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, but you've got to really actually think about what does that look like.
It's the
do
difference
effort.
between a check mark,
Yeah.
we're trans inclusive, look at us,
Right.
and hey, we're actually committed to serving these people, and that is a completely different practice.
And how do we collaborate with the community to say, tell us, what do we need to be doing so that Peace at Home, or the places that we're speaking of, or my own practice, should we be doing that isn't working out, right?
So to wrap it all up, if there are some things that, like some advice or something, if someone in the viewers' lives has experienced domestic violence, and is a member of the LGBT plus community, how can they support them? So what are some tactics that can be used to show support for survivors of domestic violence?
So I think what we're asking here is like, if you believe that somebody that you know is both queer and experiencing partner violence,
Yes.
what's a way that you can make yourself a safe space for them to talk? What's a way that you can start that conversation with them?
Yeah. I think too, the idea of, I'm a big proponent of information. So, but also understanding too that when we give information, that if you receive any of the type of help, right, the little bids that we give to our people. But I do think that putting out bids is important, and I also think, that there does come a point, depending on the amount of violence and the severity, that, tapping into that person's resource system, hopefully they do have one, and I think that and I do hesitate to verge into this, but then there is that other idea, if somebody doesn't have any support at all, and they are being, severely abused, that conversation about, calling in support, that, and this is where like the Duluth model does talk about, intersecting, the criminal justice systems, with the legal systems, and, the therapeutic systems, and sometimes we do have to tap those in order to get somebody safe. I do hesitate to verge into that, because I'm not a mandated supportive person, but that's, there's a swath of, spectrum of, to answer that question.
But if you
Right.
just have a friend, you're just a
It's like, but what if it's
person,
friends? I'm like, look, there's a lot of situations here.
Not a mandated reporter, and it's not. I'm not like you are in like your life is in danger tonight. Like if it's just like I see some stuff and I don't know consent.
I think being willing to be awkward is
Yeah.
a great start.
Yeah.
Just to say, hey, I'm noticing things, because so often
I care about you.
I care about you, and you have all the autonomy in the world to own your truth, whether that is, hey, don't worry about it, or, hey, I really need help. Giving them the autonomy to say, hey, I'm noticing something, and I am here. What do you want to do next? What is your
And
best
also
interest.
pinpointing, one thing I will say that when I do try to intervene with, whether it's a friend or somebody I'm working with, I make it really clear that my goal is to end violence, not your relationship.
Yeah.
If you want to stay in the relationship, right, because that is a whole, but this idea of like if there's violence occurring, and it's something that we can pinpoint, I really focus in on how do we, stay safe from the violence and do problem solving around that, but that I'm not interested in, this idea that you have to, be done with your partner. And so sometimes focusing in on those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think that is such an important point that, it's true across many different domains of domestic or interpersonal violence, that people who are in those relationships likely are not going to be ready to leave right away.
And that's the choice
and that because so much of the trauma of those abusive situations is that taking away their autonomy, their ability to choose, that even if it's meant well, if you have a friend and you
Putting it on the table is gonna just
Yeah.
make them run.
Yeah, to say like, well, you just need to leave them.
But then you're doing the thing.
Right. Yeah.
You're
You're
control,
prescribing
forcing,
what's needing to
prescribing,
happen,
that's
and
right.
so just being sensitive to being able to balance offering support, expressing care, prioritizing safety, but also really highlighting the importance of moving at the pace and
Meeting
comfort
them where they're at.
of of the person who's needing the support.
And I think it can be really helpful to recognize that if you're recognizing violence in a relationship, you can seek support on how to navigate that.
Mhm.
We have all sorts of opportunities to contact advocates at Peace at Home, and that's a major source of people who reach out to us. Not just people who are experiencing violence, but friends, family members saying, how do I show up for this person? And also, how do I face the possibility that they might not leave as quickly as I want them to
And then
leave?
how do I stay regulated?
And how do I stay
And
regulated?
remember that
Yeah.
thing, and then other people are going to do the
Yep.
stuff around
Yep.
us, and
Yep.
we don't go into that mode of then unconsciously trying
Yes.
to control.
And I think black and white thinking too can play into this. We want to think safer. And so many times when we love somebody, we want them to be safe now.
Right. In the
Right
way
now.
that we want.
And the way that we want it. And we define safe on our terms. Instead of
Right.
thinking, what's one step that we can get to towards safer?
A specific behavioral
Yeah.
something that leads to them being safer, that they agree to,
Yeah.
and that we can check back in on,
Yeah.
and that we can, build.
And I can't emphasize enough too how aware people who are in domestic violence relationships or violence relationships of any kind, how aware they are of the taboo around domestic violence. And so revealing that that's going on in their lives, they understand the concept of mandated reporting. They understand that how great a risk it is that somebody is going to be like, your story is now mine, and I am going to run. Like I've got it. I'm running, and like that feeling of, like you were talking earlier about, like is this relationship safer or is out there safer, and giving people the freedom to be the boss of where they want to be there is just so important. Because I think we think a lot about this for kids, right? That if that child is having not a great experience at home, they also may not have a great experience in foster care, and that kid is aware of that. Like if I say something to my teacher, and then CPS comes and then I get taken out, like that is not a better
It may not
situation,
be
but I don't
the-
want to go
right.
anywhere, right? And so, and I think that is a different version of that is very
Yeah,
true,
and
that
then you
somebody's
add
going to
children
confront my
into
partner,
this
somebody's
conversation,
gonna, I mean,
and
that's a whole,
into the whole,
right.
all these layers we're talking about, and especially that mandated reporting layer.
yeah, and just believing that we're the savior, that we're better positioned than the person that's in their relationship, that like if a friend tells you that she's not in a great spot and then she fears that you're going to go and tell her partner, that like confront the partner, you're better at confronting than she is, like hard no, like no, do not take over.
Well, I think
Right.
what you're describing is like the posture that we show up into these conversations with has to be recognizing not only the courage of somebody who's going through that to even share any of that experience with you, but also how much inside knowledge they have about that relationship. They're the expert on what that looks like. That cycle we were talking about, they're the person that knows how that goes and what they're risking by changing anything about that. And so
And they
instead
should
of-
always take the lead. That's the consent
Exactly.
part.
Yeah, to show up as what do you want to do, but also what information do you have about what would work for you? Not
Right. I mean, I'm all about negotiating in my relationships, right? Like, they get to take the lead, I take the lead, we have autonomy, but I can't, that's when we see something unsafe or the violence, negotiating it with them, in terms of the way we have relationships, but the idea of taking it over and being like, no, this is what we're going to do and this is how you're going to do it, that they probably won't respond and it's not helpful. But I do think we can take some agency and like, hey, I really care about you and this is really important to me and I'd like, for these specific things to, happen or to change, and are you willing to do that? But they can say no. Yes.
Or I'm willing to help you go through.
Right.
What,
Or
have
this,
you thought about solutions? What would you like to do? Just I think the posture word I think is so important. That like the posture that you take as a friend and helper and a collaborator with that person to keep them as safe as possible is so much better than like.
But in the end, we don't act on I'm just going to do this thing, even though we didn't agree on it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm going to call
Right.
the friend, or I'm going to, tell the so-and-so, or,
Or I'm gonna just like run over you and hurt you. Like that, just in the conversation, really holding space and being gentle with that person is so.
Care work. It's important. Okay, well, it is 3, so we have to wrap this up, but thank you so much for joining us. I think we had a lot of really great conversation. And I hope that we can do this again. I think that this will be a really good recurring thing. Yeah.
And thanks to everybody who joined us online.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Someone has to.
We have to end it.
Except I don't know how to end it.
We're
Do
not.
I just stop it?
We can talk about all the things.
It's all good.
I'm just getting warmed up. I have to leave, so I'm pretty much on, but.